This is the New Ideal podcast from the Ayn Rand Institute. I'm Elan Journo. With me today is Onkar Ghate and a friend of the Institute, Boaz Arad. We decided to go live today, not our usual schedule, because of the war that's unfolding now in Israel, which was launched a few hours ago by Hamas, the Islamist group that controls Gaza Strip. We wanted you on, Boaz, welcome, so you can give us a perspective. He's located in Israel, and what we'd love to hear from you is just a perspective on what are you hearing from the news, what is it like for you, and then we can turn into some commentary on what's happening.
Yeah.
Welcome, Boaz.
So thank you and thank everybody that listened to us. Today at 6 a.m., the Hamas and other fraction in Gaza launch a multi-dimensional attack on Israel by hitting Israel with a surprise attack of thousands of rockets all over the south of Israel and to the direction of Jerusalem and other cities. And while the surprise was in its height, blowing up and making a breach on the defensive fence around Gaza and sending thousands of Hamas terrorists with weapons, RPG, AK, and on motorcycles and Toyota style, Taliban style vehicles, and they just start a killing spree on everybody that was on road, spreading very fast toward the cities that are located a few minutes drive from the border with Gaza, and starting to massacre civilians. And so far, the number we know and been approved by the Israeli TV is more than 200 Israeli civilians that been massacred in the street and at homes, and more than 1,000 people that been injured, and some of them are severely injured, and we don't know if they will survive. Besides kids, women, elderly people, and some soldiers that been taken by surprise, been kidnapped to Gaza, wounded bodies and live people, and Hamas used them as a life shield in order to avoid Israeli retaliation. And this is a massive failure of preparedness, readiness, awareness, and we are just 50 years after the Yom Kippur War. That was the strategic failure of Israel and the intelligence to foresee the war that coming from all front. And we now facing something that might be even more serious. And it's have the potential to grow to the north and to Syria, Lebanon, and all the proxies of Iran that basically stand behind the scene here and have the interest to ignite all the fronts around Israel. So this is in
Well,
general the situation, and I may say that it's still going on. As we speak, I can feel it, the wave of air from the explosion of the Iron Dome, that intercepting missiles that now falling on Tel Aviv area, and there is a heavy missile bombardment from Gaza, thousands of missiles on the way to different cities in Israel. And under this situation, it's very, very difficult to organize and retaliate.
I was just going to add what I've seen, and just before we went live, you were telling us you could feel the counter rockets exploding overhead. A few years ago in 2021, there was a rocket attack from Gaza, and during 11 days, they fired something like 4,300 rockets. In the last few hours since this conflict arose, they have already fired 3,000 rockets, just to give people a sense of the intensity and the scale of this attack.
Yeah, this is something which is unheard of. I mean, I don't think that any country nowhere ever suffers such a massive bombardment of rockets. And I have partners to the work of the Ayn Rand Center in Israel that lives in Ashkelon, which is the large closed city to Gaza, and they are locked in the safe room from the morning with a burning car around in the parking lot from missile impact. And the situation is very chaotic. At least it was very chaotic at the beginning, and it's still going on. There is still some hostages situation in some of the cities and kibbutzim near Gaza, and there is still a pursuit after Hamas terrorists that spread all over the area among civilians and capture civilians as hostages. And it didn't end yet. I mean, the part of cleaning Israel from this terrorist attack, even before retaliating in regard to Gaza. And there is basic move to seal the border, and there was already a beginning of pounding on some target in Gaza, but this, of course, will be only the opening, and it's hard to say where it's going to lead us, because the response have to be decisive, strong, and as John Lewis wrote, nothing less than victory. And I'm afraid we are not there yet.
Well, thank you, Boaz. We appreciate you joining us today. Maybe you can hang on. We might bring you back into the conversation. But I want to bring Onkar in. Onkar, we've heard from Boaz. Just to get your first impressions on what you've seen so far.
Yeah, obviously it's horrible. I feel very bad for the people in Israel. I'm glad Boaz is doing okay. Some of the world leaders have expressed the view that they're shocked by what is happening, and that is crazy. That one could be shocked that you have armed militants, and you can call them terrorists, but I mean these are really military organizations that is dedicated to the destruction of Israel, and that they attack Israel should not be shocking. It should be shocking. Shocking might be the Israeli intelligence failure, that they seem to have been taken by surprise, but that is what Hamas is dedicated to, and that their whole reason for being is to do this kind of thing. That's what they are, and it should not shock anybody in the world that this is happening. So that the immediate react, and that it's, oh, we don't want it to escalate and so on. Their goal is the destruction of Israel. Like, how are you not going to escalate that? That is their whole mission. And if people will not face that fact, this just repeats in cycles, years. This is not the most powerful enemy, but if you don't face the fact that this is an enemy that needs to be destroyed, it will come back again and again and again, and that is part of what Israel is facing.
Yeah, I saw a comment, I think, from one of the Israeli officials saying this is their Pearl Harbor moment, and I'm sympathetic to that for all the reasons that Boaz mentioned: the severity of this attack, the scale of it, and the lack of military preparedness, and it sounds like it's just the beginning, so it's going to become a worse conflict. And others have likened it to Israel's 9/11, and I think in some respects I can understand why that's the reaction. But as you're saying, I want to just underline on that, because if anyone's been paying attention, they need to look at what Hamas is doing, what it's geared to do, why it exists, and then just go back to 2021 or 2014 or 2012 or 2009 or 2005. All of those were cases where Hamas launched attacks, usually by rockets, sometimes other weapons. In one case, they dug tunnels to infiltrate. So all of the things that are now coming into this conflict, there were so many signs that this is the direction they were going in, both militarily, tactically, and in terms of their overall goal, that in those respects, it was really a matter of time. And this is the part, just to connect to what you're saying, this is the part that I think is the crucial point that is missed. And that is, the only reason we are seeing this conflict right now is that there has been a complete failure to respond to what Hamas is about. And this is both on the side of the Israelis and on the side of their ally, the US and many other countries. And by that, I mean that there is no proper evaluation of what Hamas is, why it exists and what it's doing. And Hamas, I think of as the leading Palestinian faction. It's a representative of a wider movement. So there's what I call, and so this is something I analyze in depth in my book, What Justice Demands, America and the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. I call it What Justice Demands because to me, the core issue in this conflict is the moral assessment of the adversaries. And my assessment of the failure of the Israelis and the US and others who see themselves as on the right side of this is that they are not taking seriously the moral character of Hamas or of Israel. And they try to walk this line of, well, there's some valid points on both sides. We don't want to take sides too strongly, and there's a way to find some reconciliation between the two. We need a two-state solution, which is the article of faith that it's mind-boggling that persists today. It's 30 years since that whole venture was launched. So there's this lack of attention to how are we actually thinking about these two sides? Is Hamas really going to create a society that makes people free, that allows people to be free and prosper? Or is it really a nihilistic movement seeking to destroy a free society, which is Israel? That whole kind of analysis that requires applying rational moral principles to this conflict, that's what's missing. That's core to the Western/US perspective on this issue. And the more you take that perspective, that kind of moral agnosticism, or sometimes it's moral equivalence, depends on which side of the political spectrum you look. The more you take that, the more you become an apologist for the Palestinian movement's attacks and initiation of force against Israel. And the more you whitewash them. And I think that is part of what we've seen for decades now. It's actually very difficult to talk about this today. I've been watching the news in preparation for knowing we would go live today, and it's really, really disturbing. And I say this as someone who's spent years studying this conflict, and I've had to read and watch and listen to things that you can't unsee and you don't want to. And I spent a bit of time this morning, and I recommend people do this actually, looking at some of the videos that are surfacing on the media, on CNN, particularly because they're trying to validate some of these videos, but you can see them on Twitter, or X as it's called today. And I say this because I think it's important to see what Hamas is like. And I think of Hamas as, it is not a minority faction in a larger community that opposes it. It sees itself, and I think for good reason, it is the face of the Palestinian movement. And some of the things I've seen, I won't try to describe them, but Boaz told us about hostage taking. He told us about killing people at random, massacring people in the field, desecrating bodies. This is the face of what it looks like. This is the face of the Palestinian movement. There is no legitimate goal after which they're motivated to work. They're just there to tear things down and kill people. And the one hope I have out of this conflict is that this will be a moment of reckoning for people who have been lying to themselves, that the Palestinian movement really just is a movement about righting wrongs from history. And I don't think that's true. And I think this is a moment where there has been ample evidence of that for years, but this perhaps will refocus people on this issue. I just want to turn it back to you, Onkar, for a minute, if you have any thoughts on that before we turn to other topics on this.
Yeah, that's a crucial point. And it's anybody who is on the side of individuals who are actually interested in peace, in freedom, in living a prosperous life, whether they're born in Palestine or Palestinian or Israeli, would be pro the Israeli government and anti-Hamas. You will be anti any dictatorship, whether it's secular or religious. And all you need to know about Hamas, this would be sufficient. Even if they weren't dedicated to the destruction of Israel, they're an authoritarian, dictatorial gang. and they terrorize their own people. And it's not surprising then they'll terrorize their neighbors. And if anybody who thinks that, oh, that like I care about Palestinians, and you should care about Palestinians who genuinely want freedom. But if you actually care about those people, you have to be aggressively anti-Hamas, anti the PLO, basically anti every group that says that they speak for Palestinians. Or what they speak for is forced violence, dictatorship, and the destruction of Israel, of everybody, including Israel. And so anybody who thinks that we have, that like there's some good or something on both sides that we have to somehow broker a ceasefire and an agreement and so on, is aiding and abetting killing people.
It's a difficult point to say as fighting is unfolding, and I hesitate to bring this up, but I think it's important to say it, that in significant part, this explosion, this attack, this sort of horrific attempted invasion in different ways and massacring, this was entirely preventable. And I don't mean this as an issue of military preparedness or intelligence. And I expect there'll be analysis of that, but that's not my point. I think the point is deeper in that there were multiple opportunities in the past when the conflicts that Hamas started were of a much smaller scale. Hundreds of rockets, not thousands. A few people trying to crawl out of tunnels, not dozens, not armed, and not with the sophisticated drones that they now have. Many years ago, all of the dress rehearsals, in effect, for this that we're seeing today in the news. And the reason that Israel, which has the capability to end Hamas, to liquidate this movement, to uproot it from the Palestinian society and defeat it, and I think that's the goal it should have. It should have as a goal the elimination of Hamas, the defeat of it, and victory over it in that sense. The Israelis refused to do that, and they didn't refuse to do that on their own. They did that with pressure from the United States in many cases, and the UN, the United Nations, and practically every country that sees itself as an ally of Israel, that sees itself as standing for freedom and sees itself as standing for the values of free societies. And multiple occasions when Israel was facing a similar or smaller scale confrontation like this, they held back. They did not act in self-defense fully. They left enough of what was Hamas so that Hamas rebuilt. And this is a cycle now that it's practically like clockwork. And I mentioned earlier the 2021, 2014, there's so many of these instances. And in all of those, as strong as the Israeli response was, it wasn't designed to completely eradicate this movement and defeat it and make it clear that anyone who takes up arms in the name of this cause is pursuing a lost cause. They did not do that. And that was part of a policy they held, which viewed it as they're going to reduce the level of threat down, knowing that it will come back. And if you do that, you're being irresponsible. And this is part of what makes it difficult, because Israel is fighting to defend itself against these people. But it's still true that I think that's negligent. The responsibility of a government facing an attack like this is to eliminate that threat as quickly and efficiently as possible with minimum loss of life on their own side. And to fail to do that, and deliberately knowing that this just means you're kicking the can down the road, you're allowing them time to rearm and come back at you, that is negligence. That is not what it looks like to defend yourself and to defend the freedom of the people who are in that society. And I think I want to tie this to US policy. So I'm circling around topics that I talk about in the book, What Justice Demands. And I talk about some of these past conflicts and the mentality of the Israeli policy toward this. But I think it's important to tie this to a wider context where America has a significant role in this conflict, not only as a self-styled arbiter trying to bring the two sides over many decades into some sort of negotiated settlement, some sort of so-called peace process, but also as a major force pressuring Israel and pressuring it to appease and allow the Palestinians to get away with murder, essentially. I mean, there's no way around that. And that has been true. And this is a point I develop in the book. You see this not only under Democratic leadership, you see it under Republican leadership. And even the so-called, find the most pro-Israel Republican in the White House, and I'll show you evidence that they were not truly pro-Israel. If what you mean by that is recognizing a free society as morally superior to a dictatorship, a theocracy, which is what the Palestinians are working for and have established, and the idea that you have to discriminate morally between those two kinds of societies. And that is a significant failure across many, many years, across different administrations. And I think this is, and I raise this because America is seen as America's shield. And in some ways it is. It provides military support, and it has, rhetorically at least, is vocal in supporting Israel. But I don't think in substance that's really true, because what that requires is a moral strength and a moral clarity that has been absent for decades.
The way I think about it is that U.S. foreign policy, and as you said, it's across decades, it's Republicans, Democrats, it's every president since at least Carter, is not pro-Israel because they're not pro-American. We do not have a foreign policy that is pro-America, and the consequence is we don't have a foreign policy that's pro-Israel, because it would be an essential part of American foreign policy if it were actually dedicated to protecting and advancing the U.S. interest, that we would view Israel as an unalloyed ally, and we would be on its side as the representative of peace, technology, reason, science in an area of the world that has disdain for all those things, and including political freedom. And the fact that it's, we don't want to be seen as too much on the side of Israel because it might upset Saudi Arabia or some other dictatorship and so on. It's so profound. It's profoundly immoral, and it's profoundly anti-American, and it's against our interest. And the part of the context for what is happening now, and I think basically we've talked about this on many podcasts, that the context for understanding all the major events in the 21st century, in my view, is 9/11. And this came to the fore in 9/11, that what should have happened when America was attacked on September 11th is, our foreign policy has failed. We don't know what we're doing. We have to radically and fundamentally rethink what we're doing. Part of that should have been, our only actual ally in the Middle East is Israel. And we need to view that in the right way and be 100% on Israel's side. And there was talk after 9/11, we need a coalition. And instead of the coalition just being the US and Israel, and we're now going to both countries are going to reverse course in their foreign policy. They're not going to appease, they're not going to try to have agreements, they're not going to think the other side actually values anything other than their destruction. And so the only goal should be to end the threat of these regimes, principally and centrally Iran. And we should have allied with Israel towards the goal of the complete destruction, which means the destruction of the Iranian regime. That if we're doing regime change, Iraq was not the important thing. It was Iran had to be basically politically destroyed. And it actually, my view of the Middle East is it's one of the country, or maybe the only country other than Israel, that you could imagine some pro-freedom factions and groups actually arising if you got rid of the religious dictatorship in Iran. And far from doing that, if you remember in the days and weeks after 9/11, the U.S. went out of its way. We can't look like we're too much in agreement with Israel, and we might upset Saudi Arabia and other Arabs and Muslims and so on. So and we actually proposed a coalition that Iran would be part of. And it's such a betrayal of Israel, but it's such a betrayal of the United States. And this is after we're attacked, and 2,000 plus people are killed, and we can't say, look, the only people who are actually on the side of freedom in the Middle East is Israel, and so they should be our allies, and completely our ally. And like, if you have a foreign policy like that, what can you expect? You can't predict philosophically when the next attack will be, and so on. But we've talked a lot about the aftermath in 9/11 of how disastrous it is for the U.S., and it's going to be a disaster for its allies. People who are actually on the side of the same values that the U.S. should be, and Israel's paying part of that price.
I want to bring in a couple of questions that we're getting on YouTube. Thanks for those of you who joined us today, and we appreciate your support. And if you have further questions, we'll try to fit them in as best we can. And I expect we'll talk more about this subject on future podcasts. So if you don't get your question in today, we'll come back to you at some point, hopefully. One of the questions is Israel still supplying water and electricity to Gaza? That comes up twice. I think I want to touch on this topic because I think it goes to a deeper issue we talked about. So we talked about the thinking around foreign policy, the moral equivalence, and then you've been raising the way that has rippled through since 9/11 in American thinking too. I just want to bring out more that in my view, this is essentially a moral issue, not a foreign policy issue. So the way I think of foreign policy and the way I write about it in the book is through the perspective that what defines foreign policy are your moral principles. And if you shirk that, or if you have the wrong moral principles, or if you think they're irrelevant, all of that is destructive. So this question about, is Israel supplying water and electricity to Gaza, you can broaden it to, has Israel, this is in the context of, for the last decade plus, Israel has put Gaza on and off under a blockade. Naval and other kinds of cargo are not allowed to come in. They have to inspect everything. So they have done that precisely because of the previous attacks. So they don't want military equipment being smuggled in. They don't want Hamas getting money and so forth. So there's been a blockade. But at the same time, and this goes to the part of the moral issue, Israel has supplied Gaza with electricity and water and other resources, so the medical supplies and things like that. And that, I think, is an example of an idea that Ayn Rand uniquely defined, which is the idea of the sanction of the victim. So when you actively support those who are out to destroy you, and this is a stark example of it, because this isn't subtle. This is not somebody who's trying to behind the scenes manipulate you and undermine you. They're passing regulations that are hard to understand, but in the end, they're really going to cripple your business or something along those lines, which is actually an example of the kind of thing that she's talking about, the many manifestations of this phenomenon. But the essential is that you, in effect, enable, fund, enrich, feed, support those who are out to get you, to destroy you, to undermine you. And in this case, I don't think it's defensible for Israel to do this. And I think they do it because they don't have the moral confidence to say, no, we can't support you. We can't enable you because we know the consequences. I think there's an element of evasiveness about this, such that wouldn't the natural thing to do 15 plus years ago when Hamas takes over this Gaza Strip is to completely shut them down, let them implode, and worse, maybe go in there if you have to. But instead of that, they have enabled them to persist. And the same is true with the so-called blockade, which I mentioned briefly. The blockade is a topic that critics of Israel have been wheeling out periodically to demonstrate how merciless and cruel Israel is. And I think of it as it's the inverse. It's an evidence of how Israel is negligent in its defense of its own people by allowing a porous blockade to enable Hamas to stay in power. So in effect, it's propping up those who are out to destroy it. So I think this is a crucial issue. So I don't know if they're going to keep the electricity going or the water. Maybe they will pause it, but I would be surprised if they end it permanently. And we'll see how this conflict unravels. But to me, that is a fundamental issue that's part of what it means to think about foreign policy from a moral perspective. And I think Ayn Rand's moral theory gives us such powerful tools for understanding situations that are highly complex like this one. And I think some of what you were raising, Onkar, about the way we treat Saudi Arabia and Iran. Just the other week, we did a podcast about the whitewashing of Saudi Arabia under the Biden administration. There was talk about the Saudis will normalize relations with Israel if they get a nuclear facility, they get more weapons, and they get the U.S. to agree to defend Saudi Arabia in a mutual defense pact, which for people interested, go listen to that podcast. But that is another example of ignoring the nature of Saudi Arabia and enabling it to continue doing bad things that harm American interests. And that's sort of the defining feature of our relationship with Saudi Arabia for as long as I've been noticing it, and definitely since 9/11, and that's what it should not be. So in every direction that you look here, and this is a theme that I try to develop in the book, is that the issue is essentially moral. You really have to think about the character of the adversaries, the character of the different players in the region, and use that knowledge, that moral knowledge, to guide policy and political considerations. And to the extent that you don't do that, you're hamstringing yourself. You're making it impossible or severely hampering your ability to both define and understand and pursue your own interests.
And you have to be willing to do this at a fundamental level. So in the end, foreign policy is an issue of application. If we're talking about the self-interest of a nation or of a free nation, the self-interest of the US or of Israel, you're thinking about the self-interest of a country. But the deeper question is morality about self-interest, or is it about surrendering and sacrificing your self-interest? And you brought up the sanction of the victim. And part of the reason that Ayn Rand can identify this as a principle that is operative in so many cases, and how the good is undermined by its own acquiescence, is that she, more fundamentally, is the opponent of altruism. She's the opponent of a morality that tells you that self-sacrifice is good, noble, what you should do. And you have to take seriously that people are told this repeatedly, and that in times of crises, part of what happens is people revert to a moral perspective. And if this is their moral perspective, it paralyzes the good and it emboldens evil. And if do you think of it in this context, part of what the sanction of the victim means, that we've heard this over and over and over again, is love your enemy. That is the explicit call for the victim to offer not blows to the person who's persecuting him, but his own love. That's what the sanction of the victim means. You're attacking me, and I'm going to treat you as like, oh yeah, you're a good person. Maybe I should even love you. And so that call is one of the most immoral calls that there has ever been in the history of ideas. Like Jesus, in that kind of pronouncement, it's one of the most evil things that has ever been pronounced in the history of ideas. But people take that seriously, like it's uncontroversial. Love your neighbor and even your enemy. And that is actually what has happened over and over in the Middle East, both from the US and from Israel. I mean, so just thinking about Hamas, it's after 9/11, and there were further attacks after 9/11. Our foreign policy was to bring the vote to these people, explicitly acknowledging, yeah, even if they vote in people who want to kill us and want to eradicate Israel, yeah, that's what we have to do. And that is the implementation and practice of the moral principle of you have to love your enemy. And this is part of what it means, that these ideas have consequences. It's easy to gloss them over. Yeah, we've all heard this, and maybe people don't really believe it and so on. But the foreign policy is such an obvious example, if you care to actually look at it and think of what is actually happening, of these ideas actually being put in practice. And they're being put in practice because people actually believe them and have been taught over and over to believe them. And unless you're willing to question that and to think, yeah, maybe it's all wrong, not just like it's a little bit wrong. It's like everything we've been told about this is wrong. You're never going to get a reversal of strategy. And that's part of the tragedy of America's foreign policy and Israel's as in part as a consequence.
One thing I anticipate after this conflict comes to some sort of resolution or a stalemate, or whatever the outcome is, a couple of things to anticipate, and I think they all are related to this theme that we've been talking about, the way moral ideas play out and the need to question them fundamentally. One of the things to anticipate is the accusations of so-called war crimes. I say so-called not because I don't think people commit atrocities in war, because I think the way people think about how to evaluate those is wrong. I expect that will come up, and it will be lopsided towards Israel's not the one following the moral ideas on this issue, so not following the international norms on this, even as Hamas is obviously doing the exact same things and much, much worse things, and it won't be held to account, because I think the way people think about war crimes and morality in war is pervaded by this altruistic, self-sacrificial perspective. And so that is what we saw in previous rounds of this conflict, with Israel being taken over the coals and long UN reports about how it has failed to meet the international laws of war, even as Hamas is ignoring them and flouting them, because it's a completely perverse approach which holds the better party in a conflict to a standard that the other party just knowingly flouts, and you can't avoid that. That's just inherent in an altruistic principle, like the kind that are governing the laws of war. And another thing to anticipate coming forward, once this gets further down the road, is that I don't think there's a way around the fact that what isn't being evaluated is the ideas on both sides. And we've been arguing, and this is something I develop in the book, and I think it's a complex point to make it objective, but I think in this context, there's a day and night difference between Israel and the Palestinians, and the Palestinian movement, I should say, not individual Palestinians. I want to distinguish there. And Hamas is I think the most clear-cut example of just how evil this movement is. It's exploitative of the Palestinians themselves, and it's hostile to freedom within its own territory and against Israel. But the point I want to draw out here is that one can't look at this conflict and can't look at this current fighting that's happening right now as I'm speaking. You can't look at it and imagine that you can come to understand it without bringing the kind of moral perspective we've been talking about, but even more deeply, you can't understand it without bringing a wider philosophic framework to this. And that has to, when we're evaluating Hamas versus Israel, part of what we're evaluating is, what are the ideas that animate them? What kind of society are they building? Those are philosophic questions. How do they treat their own people? That's a philosophic question. And to understand the Middle East, you have to understand the ideas that dominated. And one of the failures you were alluding to, Onkar, in the post 9/11 period, and even before, but it was more apparent in the period afterwards, is the evasion of the dominant ideas in the region. The evasion that for decades, and the major turning point was 1979, the Islamist movement was coming to dominate people's thinking throughout the region. And that was a big change. That was an ideological change that the Islamists came to supplant the socialists, leftists, and nationalists who were dominant for many decades in the 20th century. But that is something that you have to understand as a fundamental that shapes the Middle East. And that is just absent from policy thinking and from foreign policy in the US. And that's crucial, because that's, to your point about why Iran was so central post 9/11 and before, it's precisely because Iran is an embodiment and sees itself as trying to lead the Islamist movement. And Hamas is it's not a puppet of Iran, but it's ideologically allied with Iran. It's supported by Iran. They collaborate, they work together because they have similar goals. They're theocratic, dictatorial, and I think in the end nihilistic. They're not trying to create societies in which people can live and thrive. They're trying to dominate people and destroy human lives. And that is a crucial perspective. And I think that's part of what philosophy brings. And I think Ayn Rand's philosophy in particular brings to this whole issue. So it's, I think it takes work to think about what's happening in the region. It takes specialized knowledge in many cases. It takes having that, what's still necessary and what is often missing. And I think this is the crucial part of what I try to do in the book, is to give people the framework for integrating all the data, integrating all the history to the extent that you can find out what's happening and understand it at that conceptual level. So versus last week, this person was shot, so there's a retaliation. Oh, there's a cycle of violence. That is the epitome of exactly what it looks like to do the wrong thing, which is to be very concrete oriented, concrete bound, and empty it of philosophic significance, empty it of all moral thinking more concretely, and just have a kind of news cycle driven understanding, which you need to know what's going on, but that's not the way to think about these issues. You need a broader framework. And I that's one of the things I hope people take away from this conversation is that, yes, as you're watching the news, it's important to know what's going on. That all has to fit into a wider picture. And that's part of what I think objectivism gives us as a way to integrate developments like that and evaluate them and think about what's coming next and what to do and why and how it is that, I mean, we haven't said this, but I think this is, it bears repeating. For the 2 decades since 9/11, we made predictions. We said, here's what to anticipate, not in a concrete sense of here's next Tuesday, this is going to happen, but this is the pattern of what to expect. This is why it's going to go wrong. And repeatedly, we were proven right. And I think it's not because we have special powers. What we have is the ability to think philosophically and understand trends and understand the fundamental role of ideas shaping policy, shaping the Middle East. And that's, I think, what's critical here is that it gives you real understanding, and absent philosophy, I think you're groping in the dark.
Yeah, that's important. That if you're really trying to understand the causality of what is going on, you have to look across years and decades. If you're just staring at the journalistic events, you'll have this kind of reaction of the world leader. Oh, I'm shocked now by what's going on. What wasn't a week ago? Weren't they talking about having some kind of agreement or ceasefire and this or that? But if you understand it in terms of the ideas and how the ideas and the motivations and how that plays out over decades, then you have a radically different perspective on what is going on. I want to say just one thing about what you brought up, because we've already started to see this about there's going to be the scrutiny of Israel's response. There's pleas from world leaders, don't escalate. So, I mean, you've got your civilians massacred in the streets, as Boaz was talking about. And really, like, what you're worried about is that they might escalate. Israel might escalate after being attacked. And anyone who has that kind of perspective might think that, well, yeah, I'm on the side of peace and I'm on the side of freedom and I just want to see people prospering, so on. But if your fundamental perspective is not, oh my God, what is Israel going to do now after many of its citizens are massacred? If your fundamental perspective is not, what does Hamas do day to day to its own subjects who are repressed, beaten, so on? And if that's not, like, if we're going to investigate and report, it's not now what is Israel going to do and what are some of its soldiers going to do, or will somebody overreact and so on. If it's not, like, what is life like under these regimes day to day? And if you're not, as we talked about earlier on, if you're not fundamentally opposed to Hamas, the PLO, and so on, you might think you're on the side, like I'm on the side of freedom and I want to see peace and prosperity, but you're not. And if what your worry is about someone acting in self-defense and how are they going to react, versus what happens to disarmed victims, that these are gangs that have seized power in these, what do they do to their disarmed subjects? If that's not your primary focus, so if the primary focus is not the evils of Hamas and the PLO, but real or alleged overreaction from some Israeli soldiers, you're not actually on the side of freedom and of life.
I just want to, we should probably wrap up in a couple of minutes. I want to make a couple of other observations related to what you're about the orientation people have. And you said this, and I want to amplify it, which is that, in my view, that if you think about individual people who identify as Palestinian, who live under Hamas or live in the West Bank under the Palestinian Authority, who see themselves as Palestinians, the forces that have been the worst in victimizing them are their own leaders. The Palestinian movement broadly, as a political enterprise over decades, it's done much worse things to them than people realize. And it not only, if you tally the cruelty and the oppression and the authoritarianism, and the dictatorship and the theocracy, it's hijacked their lives. It has brainwashed them, or it's inculcated in them an ideology that is false and destructive to them. And on top of that, it uses, to the extent there are Palestinians who've had wrongs done to them in history, and I talk about this in the book, the Palestinian movement exploits that in ways that are not just, that are violations of what justice looks like, and uses that to gain some foothold of credibility with people on the outside who have no way of understanding what's going on and are in the thrall of altruistic thinking. So that it gulls people into thinking the Palestinian cause has some legitimacy. And to me, that is an exploitation of the Palestinians generally, and an exploitation of, in particular, of the ones who have some claim that needs to be adjudicated, or had some claim in the past that needs to be adjudicated. And in that sense, the Palestinian movement is the aggressor in two directions. It's an aggressor against its own people and the people it claims to be speaking for and righting wrongs on behalf of. And it's an aggressor in what we're seeing right now in its attacks on Israel, not just today and especially today, but over many decades since it became the forefront of this conflict. So I think I just want to leave people, and I hope that's provocative, because that's not typically how people think of the Palestinian movement. And that's part of what I think you need to get to, is you need to really question what is animating both sides of this conflict, and think about that morally and deeply. Any final thoughts from you, Onkar, before we wrap up?
No, I agree that's, if people are willing to rethink this issue, that's what they have to rethink.
Yeah. I just want to see if we can bring Boaz back for just a minute and see, just to both thank you and just make sure if there's anything else you wanted to add before we wrap up, Boaz, if you're still with us. Hi, Boaz. Any final thoughts from you on the ground? I think we need to unmute you. Just a second there. Yeah. Let's try again.
Thank you all for supporting the moral side here. This is a rare voice that needs to be heard, and unfortunately, we don't have it yet in the scale that we need to have it in order to affect the American foreign policy that basically restrain the Israeli policy. And I'm afraid that even though we need to flatten Gaza, to destroy Hamas, to win, it will not be possible under these moral circumstances. So I really wish that this work that we are doing in Israel, in the US, in the Ayn Rand Institute, will prevail in the future, so we can live in a real peace.
Thanks, and stay safe. Thanks for joining us today. We'll follow this topic, and I expect we'll do more podcasts in the days and weeks to come. Thank you all for being with us today on this extraordinary episode of New Ideal Live. We will be back with another podcast sometime this week, and we look forward to joining you. Thank you all for being on the YouTube Super Chat and supporting our work, and thank you for your interest in what we have to say. We'll be back next time. Thank you.